they are things that warrant a little bit more discussion and things that, things that are gonna be important considerations, not just for the test, but for your projects and just for your knowledge in general. One of the things that I want to talk about for just a moment is something that your book refers to as a hypothetical construct. The term is on page 74. And then sit down, okay, put your feet up, stay a while.
Stay the whole time.
I see you're not alone in your flip-flops. And for those of you who are wondering why in the hell did he say that, you would have had to have been in my 11 o'clock class to have any idea. And I'm not going to go through an explanation. Okay. Hypothetical constructs. Well, let me put it this way. What is meant by the term a hypothetical construct? So that means everybody's going to look at their book, try to find the textbook definition of it. Did somebody say anything? You have to excuse me. I think I'm coming down, my ears are a little congested, so my hearing today may be even a little worse than usual.
The book says hypothetical entities created from theory and speculation.
Okay. I'm glad you phrased that in your own words. But one way to think of, what does hypothetical mean? These are things that are proposed, things that we make certain assumptions that they exist in order to help us explain something about behavior. Let me give you an example of a hypothetical construct. Anxiety. Any of you ever experienced anxiety?
Right before your tests.
If somebody didn't say that, I was going to say maybe the day of one of my tests, at least for some of you. And you shouldn't. You should feel calm, cool, collected on those days because you have prepared extensively for the test and there's no problem. You're well prepared, you're going to ace it. It's going to be so easy, it's going to be humiliating that I even gave it to you. And therefore, why are you anxious about it? Okay, but the thing about anxiety, in some ways, yes, it's very real. Everyone in here, including myself at some time or another and more than once, has experienced what we call anxiety. I know that's hard for you to believe. Harlan, getting anxious about something? Sure. I'm being somewhat facetious. But when you think about anxiety, it's more easily sensed than it is defined. You know when you're feeling anxious. But if I ask 10 of you to define anxiety for me, I bet I would get 10 different definitions. But it's something that we propose to exist to account for that internal subjective state. What about intelligence? that we can directly observe, that we can directly determine its presence and to what extent it exists? No, it's not. That's a hypothetical construct. But yet we often, using those two examples, anxiety and intelligence, they're often things that are used as explanatory mechanisms when we're trying to explain a given behavior or somebody's performance. And there's in many ways, there's a real need for the hypothetical constructs, but the problem comes into play when it comes to defining those constructs in such a way that people are in agreement about what the construct refers to. And that's where the next topic comes into play, and that is the topic of operational definitions. Now I'm going to do Alicia a favor on this one. Look at the definition on page 75. It says an operational definition is a procedure for measuring or defining a construct. In other words, you're defining it in terms of the measurements that are used to assess it. An operational definition specifies a measurement procedure or a set of operations, hence the term operational, for measuring an external observable behavior and using the resulting measures as a definition and a measurement of the hypothetical construct. You're measuring something as a way of defining the construct of interest. So if I take the hypothetical construct of intelligence, one way of defining intelligence operationally for people your age might be your score on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. On the commonly used intelligence scales today, what score is considered to be average intelligence? Now, by scores, I'm referring to IQ scores, which are derived from intelligence tests. But if I were to administer the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale to one of you or all of you, and I told you that your IQ was 120, would that be average, above average, below average?
Average.
Above?
It's average.
It's above average. How much above average? In terms of standard deviations?
No.
Yes.
I'm touching that.
We had on standard deviations in class earlier today. One of the reasons I mention that is because two good examples of the utilization of a descriptive statistic in the real world of psychology. And a good example of why knowing what a standard deviation is, how to calculate it, how to interpret it, is relevant and not irrelevant, as some people would like to think. Well, it's 1 1/3 standard deviations above average. How in the hell do I know that?
Because you're above average.
But I don't go around administering intelligence tests to people. It's not my gig. Although I know how to do it, but that's not something I do. operationally used intelligence test is considered to be 100. Standard deviation of 15. So that's how I calculated the number of standard deviations. 120 would be above the mean. And 1.33 would be an example of a what from statistics.
Z-score?
Z-score.
Damn, I did learn something. One thing.
Bingo. Z-score tells you the number of standard deviations a score is away from the mean.
You proud of me?
I'm proud of it. By the way, I happen to notice Kyla sitting over here. I need to talk to you briefly right after class.
Okay.
It's not a big deal. But it's about, well, I'll just need to talk to you for just a minute concerning an email I got from the registrar's office
Okay.
about you.
In case that wasn't clear.
Okay. Now, let's think about this. The reason I'm doing this for several reasons. I don't have to justify. I'm just sit there and be quiet and listen to me. And write down everything I say religiously, right? Ty? Because it's the gospel truth, and I would never tell you anything other than the gospel truth. But let's think about those, I've given you some idea of the scoring on an intelligence test. Therefore, if I said, if you were, let's say you were interested in some kind of teaching method and you were wondering if that particular method would result in higher intelligence in your students. And you were using IQ scores as your operational definition of intelligence. Now, let me ask you this. Where would you draw the line and what score or range of scores would you specify as indicating greater or lesser intelligence?
It'll be a number of standard deviations away from the mean.
Well, possibly. Possibly. So the more standard deviations that deviates from the mean, the more, quote, intelligent a person is, or the less intelligent a person is. Supposedly. The thing is, you would have to, you need to specify not only intelligence test scores when you're operationally defining it, but you would also need to be a little bit more specific and designate at least a range of intelligence test scores that you would use to define or to describe somebody that you consider to be intelligent in your study or that you're classifying as intelligent in your study. For the most part, if a person had an IQ of 75, would we classify that as high intelligence? No. Okay, let's look at a couple of other situations and talk about operational definitions. You going back to psychometrics or to tests and measurements again. We could use a similar kind of situation in operationally defining anxiety or operationally defining depression. That operational definition might be a particular score or a particular range of scores on the depression inventory if you're measuring depression. Or the score or range of scores on the state trait anxiety inventory if you're measuring anxiety. Let's say you're studying cognitive abilities in alcoholics. so you're comparing alcoholics to non-alcoholics. How would I know what you mean when you say alcoholic? What qualifies a person as being an alcoholic?
Someone who consumes more than the average amount of alcohol
Okay, drinks more than average.
on a regular basis.
What if they just drink maybe an ounce more than average?
I guess it would be
Well, I'm
more
just-
than average. I don't know.
Do I care?
You're fine.
I think we know what you're talking about.
I mean, if I ask you, if I said, okay, write down a definition of alcoholism, or an alcoholic, how many of you think would end up with pretty much the same definition? You need to be pretty specific if you're gonna refer to alcoholics. And your definition of what an alcoholic is. Now, again, as I've said numerous times, there's no there's no gold standard definition of an alcoholic. You define it in terms of how you're measuring that and how you're defining it, and that is up to the investigator to do that. It doesn't have to be, and usually isn't, a perfect definition. I don't know that a perfect definition of that exists. But your definition has to be such that everybody who reads that article knows exactly what you mean when you use the term alcoholic. Maybe they drink X amount, Y times a week for a period of Z years, or whatever your definition is. That's the purpose of an operational definition. The reader is not sitting there thinking, well, what in the hell do they mean? An alcoholic could be this, it could be that, it could be any number of things. By operationally defining the term, they know what you're referring to. And they could use that, if they chose, as their own operational definition of an alcoholic. Hunger. There's one for you. Operationally define hunger. One operational definition might be Caitlin's behavior at the cafeteria. I want to keep picking on you.
Okay.
You got a fork in one hand and a shovel in the other hand. And the number of trips between plate and mouth. Might be watching Ty eat a bacon cheeseburger at the grill. I'm kidding, but think about it for a minute. Operationally defining hunger might be kind of tough to do. You have to do a little thinking about that. And one of the things you need to pay attention to when you're reading articles are the operational definitions that the authors are using in their papers. Okay. Notice on page 76 something I want to bring your attention. It says limitations of operational definitions. One of the things it points out is that an operational definition is not the same as the construct itself. Because when you measure intelligence, you're measuring observable, measurable characteristics of this thing that we call intelligence. You're using things you can measure and observe to infer the presence or absence of intelligence. It's not the same thing as intelligence. And sometimes the operational definition is, this just reinforces what I already said. It may leave out important dimensions of the construct. Because when you're operationally defining depression, is your operational definition going to include every possible characteristic of of depression? Is it going to address potential problems with sleep? Is it going to address potential problems with self-esteem? Is it going to social withdrawal? You get to where you think about all the symptoms of depression, you address each and every one of them, you're going to have an operational definition that's a mile long. And it's going to be hard to find people who meet that operational definition. Unless you catch them coming out of statistics class, and then there it's clear cut. Everybody coming out of that class is depressed, right, Taylor?
Yep.
Permanently. I don't think so. Look at you. Do you look depressed?
No, because I'm done with it. And then I had to get in this class.
You're not done with it.
Well, I'm done with that class.
You're done with that class, but you're not done with statistics. You're gonna revisit that here. And if you go on to a graduate program, you're gonna revisit it there. Got to decide not to go to graduate school?
It's coming along.
Okay. Generally, it's a good idea to at least address two or more characteristics of the construct, not just a particular one. And it also goes on to talk about not only the operationally defining the variables of interest, but also you have to operationally define how they're to be measured. And one of the best ways to do that is to consult previous research. See how other people are operationally defining it, see what things seem to be acceptable within the field or the topic area that you're interested in. And if you look at those and you decide you really don't like those or that they're not adequate, then come up with a revision of your own. It's always fair game to look at the measurement procedures that are utilized in a given study and to decide whether or not that was a good technique or it was maybe something else might have been a better way of doing it. You have that freedom as long as you can offer a reasonable justification for it. It's not acceptable to just say, well, I think this is the way it ought to be, so I'm going to do it this way. It's okay to think that way, but why do you think that way? What's the rationale for your decision? What's the rationale for your conclusion? The world of research is far more than just a world of opinion. Opinions are fine, but you got to support them if you got them. Actually, I think that's a good rule of thumb to live by. Opinions are fine, but support them if you got them. Okay. Now, two other important topics. Validity and reliability. Have any of you taken the test and measurements class? Only offered it twice since I've been here. Probably be offering it again relatively soon. Okay, let's begin with the discussion of validity of a measurement. Now, in general, what we mean by validity is whether or not our measurement procedure actually measures what it claims to be measured. It's valid if it actually measures the construct we're trying to, or even the behavior we're trying to measure. Does it do what it's supposed to do? Sometimes that's relatively straightforward, other times that's a little bit more difficult to determine. For measuring intelligence, it's a little bit more difficult to determine. We can't directly observe it, we can't directly measure it, we have to measure some external manifestation of intelligence and infer, based on those observations, we infer whether it exists and to what extent it exists. And there are people who do question the validity of intelligence test scores. And to some extent, I would agree with them. While we're on the topic, I'll just go on record as saying I don't think it's necessarily a useful piece of information to even know what your IQ is. In fact, if you were to take an IQ test, you should only be, the person who administered it, scored it, and interpreted it should only tell you a range of scores that your score fell in. They should never tell you a specific score, but rather a range of scores. Like, they operationally defined above average, genius. No, I don't think there's genius in there. And also, you gotta think about the fact that, I've known some faculty members in my career who probably on an IQ test would score at least 2, maybe 3 standard deviations above the mean. In many ways, they're brilliant individuals. But on the other hand, they'd forget their butt if it wasn't tied on. You ever known people like that? Okay, not only do we need to be concerned about validity, we need to be concerned about several different kinds of validity. Your book goes through and talks about face validity, concurrent validity, predictive validity, construct validity, convergent and divergent validity. When it's all said and done, you need to know the differences among these different types of validity. What does it mean to say that something has face validity?
At face value, it does what it's supposed to do.
Do I know?
It does what it's supposed to do at first glance.
Okay, I was gonna say, I'm glad you threw in that qualifier at the last, that first glance. Face validity just means that if you take it at face value, it would appear that it measures what it says it measures. If you want to measure aggression and your instrument asks questions about aggression and aggressive behavior, it might have face validity. But actually, in reality, face validity is the simplest and the least useful of any of the different forms of validity. Just because it might appear that it measures something is no guarantee. that most measures will have face validity, although there are some cases where you're thinking, my God, what in the hell does this have to do with supposedly what they're trying to measure? I remember years ago in a class, actually it was an undergraduate psychological testing class that I had to take. And in that class, we had to take some of these tests, and they were scored. One in particular was the MMPI. You ever heard of the MMPI? Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. If you ever took it, you never forget it. It's got about 500 and some questions or something. And some of the items on that test, you're thinking, my God, where did they pull this one out of? What does this have to do with anything related to personality? I remember when I took it, there were questions I thought exactly that. But as you learn more about the test, you found out the reasons they were there and what they were accomplishing. So here's a test that on the one hand didn't have much faith, in that regard didn't have face validity, but it was considered at the time, I don't know how commonly it's used anymore, but at the time it was considered one of the more valid personality assessment scales. Okay, what do we mean by concurrent validity?
It determines whether or not these two match up, the way they measure, whether or not they both work.
Okay, it does refer to two different measurements. But there's a different, when we're talking about concurrent validity, in a way it's whether they both work, but there's something a little bit more specific that we're looking for here. With concurrent validity, the important consideration here is that if you're measuring something using a particular technique or strategy, do the results that you get, are they correlated with the results you would get if you were using an already well-established and widely used test for the same variable? In other words, let's go back to intelligence for just a moment. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is widely accepted, it's been around for a while. People are in that area are comfortable with it as an intelligence test. Now you have another intelligence test. It has concurrent validity if scores on it are correlated with scores you would obtain on the Wechsler scale. If they match up well with the established accepted test, then your measure has concurrent validity. And one of the things you're looking for there is consistency in the relationships between the scores. And if you look at the figure on page 80, I started to ask you a question, what are those called? But the answer is right there in front of you.
Scatter plots.
Scatter plots. And scatter plots are very useful in what area of statistics? Correlation. I'm real proud of you. Those of you who took the other statistics class Did you talk about, in that class, did you talk about variability? Did you talk about correlation and regression?
Yeah.
Did you? Did you talk about t-test,
Yeah, I think so.
analysis of variance?
Maybe, I mean, I'm sure we went over at least 3/4 of what you went
Well, we'll see. So I've talked to a lot of people that have taken the other class, and they said, what? We didn't say anything about it. Not much of that stuff. But anyway, whether you did or didn't, you need to, I mean, think about what a positive or negative or a zero correlation tells you. Tells you about the strength and the direction of a relationship. It says nothing about causality. Well, with a positive correlation, you would expect high scores on one variable to be associated with high scores on the second. Or low scores on one variable to be associated with low scores on the second. It's a negative correlation, it's an inverse relationship. High scores on one, low scores on the other. And with no correlation, or a zero correlation, there's no trend, there's no recognizable relationship between the two variables. But often when we're talking about, and particularly when we get over to talking about reliability of a measure, we'll revisit correlation coefficients, because that's one way of assessing the reliability of a measure. Predictive validity. If a measurement is able to accurately predict behavior, it's said to have predictive validity. Let me give you an example of something that is related to predictive validity, but also it's related to the other types of validity that we've talked about so far. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to rely upon my artistic abilities again and introduce you to an animal model of anxiety. You ready for this, Kinsley?
Yes.
Sure. Might want to hang on to your hat. It's going to be pretty exciting. Let me see if I can, first thing I want to do here is draw some semblance of an octagon. That's not a very good one, but it's eight-sided. No, wait a minute, let's make this simpler. Let's make it simpler because that looks like I might have brain damage. Let's go with a diagram in which I'm going to draw something that looks like a big plus, or a big plus sign.
I think you're in the wrong profession.
Do I?
This morning.
You can rectify my drawing.
No, I said I think you're in the wrong profession.
Say I should be an artist?
You guys hold the director.
No. Well, I want to make it even a little bit more. Okay. What this represents is a overhead view of something called an elevated plus maze. Some psychologists actually still use mazes to study behavior of different species, and often it's rodents, rats or mice. In this case, we're talking about rats. Now, let me explain this view you're looking at. You're looking at it down from your view is looking down at it from above. You've got a central platform here. You've got two pairs of opposing arms extending out from that central platform. Imagine that you've got, like a one before board across here, another one before here. And this part here that I've drawn in with the double lines, what that indicates is that there is a wall on these arms. In other words, as the board sticks out, you've got a wall surrounding it. Let's say it's a 3-inch wall. And those arms are referred to as closed arms. Now the other two opposing arms are referred to as open arms. Because there is no wall around them, it's just a flat surface. And this is sitting on a pedestal so that the maze is probably about this high off the ground, 3 feet or so. You put a rat in the central part of the maze, the middle part. Then you observe the rat's behavior in the maze, and what you're measuring is how many times they venture out onto the open arms, how many times they venture out onto the closed arms, how much time they spend on the open arms and closed arms. Okay, so the rat's free to do whatever it wants to. If it wants to sit here the whole time, it can sit here the whole time. If it wants to walk out here and look out over the edge and look down at the floor down below, it can do that. If it wants to spend its time in the closed arms, it can do that. Now, you take your typical run-of-the-mill laboratory rat, which I know you all have lots of familiarity with. Do you think that they would have a preference for one of the two types of arms, or no preference?
You could have more preference for the closed arms, maybe.
They have more preference for the closed arms. Now, if I were to administer, well, what that means is they're going to have more entries into the closed arms, they're going to spend more time there, and they're going to venture out onto the open ones less frequently and not stay out there a long time. Imagine you were on a maze like this, 100 feet off the ground. How many of you would spend most of your time on the open arms? Would a lot of you have a preference for the closed arms?
How wide are we talking?
For you?
Because the left side looks a little bit wider than the right.
And I mean, it's gonna be like a fun adventure, like.
I didn't draw it perfectly. Do I? Okay. Now the point is, this is used as an animal model of anxiety. One, does it have face validity?
What did you just say? No, sorry, for real, what'd you say?
I said, this is a fairly widely used as an animal model of anxiety. Does it have face validity?
Yes,
Yes.
And if it does, tell me why.
because you
As
can
a
see
rat
them.
or as a person?
Either, or both.
Because you can see what's happening.
Yeah.
Is this a valid way of assessing anxiety in a rat? And also, is it something that would have face validity in terms of what we could say about anxiety in a human?
Yeah.
Why? You're not gonna get off with just yes or
I
no.
mean, because like the obvious reasons, as if a rat, just like what you just asked us, as a person, would we do this or do that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we obviously had an answer for you, so that's face validity, isn't it?
So to some extent, you'd say what it does, because if you're making the comparison to humans,
Yeah.
many people would have a preference for the closed arm.
Yes.
So to some extent, it does have face validity. I don't know that I'd go so far as to say it has strong face validity, because particularly with human, I know. But what I'm saying is, some people would say, no, the behavior of a rat in an elevated plus maze doesn't have a damn thing to do with human anxiety. Does it have concurrent validity? Well, you may not be able to answer that question.
We don't have anything to compare.
Very good. Dang, you're making me proud today.
Yesterday, Mom won.
Tell you what, I may let you graduate after all. One of the things it does have, without a doubt, that you probably don't know, is predictability. If I give a rat an injection of Xanax, do you think the rat's behavior in this maze is going to change?
Yes.
It will, consistently. How's it going to change? They're going to be much more willing to go out on the open arms. They're going to be much more willing to spend time out there. Give you an example of that, although it wasn't used in this maze, but it's analogous. When I was in graduate school, well, my dissertation had to do with animal models of anxiety. This wasn't a particular animal model I was looking at, but I'm going to talk about the effects of anxiolytic drugs and something you might imagine here. On some days of the study, the rats were being injected with a drug called midazolam. Now, what in the hell is midazolam? If you've ever had surgery under general anesthesia, you may have been given a drug called Versed before as a pre-surgical medication to help you relax, to help reduce anxiety, that kind of stuff. That's midazolam. It's an anxiolytic drug. It's in the same class of drugs as Valium and Xanax and things like that. It's an anxiolytic. Okay, here's where it gets kind of interesting. In running the rats, there was a colony room where the rats were housed, and then the experimental chambers were in a separate room. And I would inject the animals with the drugs in the colony room, and then later carry them in a circular wire mesh carrier to the experimental room to put them into the operating chambers. Some days they were receiving an injection of an anxiogenic drug, one that produces anxiety. It didn't take me long to figure out that even if I hadn't known what I'd injected a given animal with that day, I could tell exactly which of the two they were on, just simply by their behavior and by the way they felt when I picked them up. Because this circular wire carrier that I used was about this big in diameter, about this deep, and I would have generally 4 rats in there that I was carrying at a time. If they'd been given the anxiolytic drug, the walls of the cylinder were real thin, I mean, maybe that thick at most. But imagine a rat perched on all four paws on a wall that's only that thick. They're up there perched on this really narrow wall looking down at the floor. And about the second day I did that, I was carrying them in there, so I was basically a rookie in this regard. One of the rats loses its balance, it falls off, does about 2.5 somersaults with a half twist on the way to the floor. I soon learned I needed to when they got up there, to kind of push them back in so that my rats didn't end up with brain damage. If they were on the anxiogenic drug, they weren't getting up there on the edge. They were down in the bottom of the carrier. I mean, it's analogous to the open arms versus the closed arms. Plus, you pick one up that was on midazolam, you could just tell they're pretty laid back. If they were on the other drug, the anxiogenic drug, you could feel they were pretty uptight. Both in watching them and in just picking them up, you could tell the difference. The point being, though, that their performance in the elevated plus maze is highly predictive of the efficacy of drugs in treating anxiety in humans. Even though we're talking two totally different species, and we're making no claims that rat anxiety is the same thing as human anxiety, rat behavior in this maze under the influence of anxiolytics is highly predictive of anxiolytic efficacy in humans. Kind of interesting. Did you know that? Did you even care? If you've ever taken an anxiolytic drug, you can bet your sweet bottom dollar that those drugs were evaluated very likely in animal models and very possibly with rats. If you've ever taken an antidepressant, same thing. If you've ever undergone cognitive behavioral therapy, same thing. I used to give CBT to my rats. You believe that, Cheyenne? No, I can't give. You don't do talking therapy with rats. Rats don't need talking therapy. Okay. Let's talk about one other dimension of validity, and then we're going to call it good. We'll talk about reliability next time. Convergent and divergent validity.
I think we skipped construct.
Did I skip one?
But
Oh, construct validity. You're right.
I mean, I don't know.
No, you're right. We did. I was getting excited. Can't you tell? Okay, let's go back to construct validity. Somebody tell me, go ahead and read it real quick. See if you can tell me what construct validity refers to. Doesn't measure things that were considered to be characteristics of the construct that you're measuring.
Yep.
You're measuring aggression. Does your measurement yield results that are consistent with what we would consider to be aggressive behavior? Is it measuring those characteristics that we consider to be part of aggression or aggressive behavior? convergent and divergent validity. And I really like the idea of convergent validity, and I'll tell you why I like the idea of it. I mean, I like the others as well. But convergent validity has to do with not only the validity of a test, but it also has to do with something that I call convergent evidence. Convergent validity refers to whether or not you get similar results on two different measures of the construct. In other words, are the measures converging together and pointing in the same direction? Do the results from this test indicate that you're measuring anxiety, and do the results from this test also indicate that you're measuring anxiety? Two different tests, but they're all pointing in the same direction. Maybe three or more tests all pointing in the same direction. Convergent, they're converging in the same area. Now, let me say something about convergent evidence, which gets back to one of my major premises in this class. A single study never proves a damn thing, particularly in the behavioral sciences. And as I've said before, and I will say again, I'm going to say it now. Strike the damn word from your vocabulary and any derivation of the word. But, here's an important but. If you have evidence from different studies, from different measurements, which is the overlap with convergent validity here, and they're all converging together, they're all pointing in the same direction, the general conclusions are consistent, that's when you can start having more confidence in the validity of your study and that it is yielding valid results. And you notice I said increased confidence. I still did not say you have proof. Now, the more of that you can achieve, the closer you can come to maybe saying something about proof. But being the skeptical individual that I am, and the critical thinking individual that I would prefer that you just don't even use the terms. But nevertheless, that's what convergent validity refers to. Convergent evidence from different measures. Divergent, on the other hand, is exactly what it implies. It's evidence that you are measuring one thing and you're not measuring something else that maybe overlaps with it. In other words, you can show that while your measure is yielding results that would indicate aggressiveness or aggression, when other measures that don't measure aggression, they're not indicating anything suggestive of aggression. In other words, you're discriminating and showing that you're measuring something somewhat specific and not just some general characteristic that may not be part of what you're really interested in. I'm going to stop there for today.